they would require the Samoans, for example, to use their traditional mechanisms for distributing hereditary titles at death, or instead of using titles like a monetary currency, or to use traditional building materials in building their houses and so on. And so these kinds of practices required collaboration on the part of many of the colonized. As soon as the colonized refused to play their assigned roles, a native policy regime came to an abrupt halt. And the flip side of collaboration or refusal is active resistance, of course. And in colony after colony, we find cases of the colonized just actively refusing to play their role, in which case a new round of seeking a sort of regime of native policy is set into motion if colonialism is not overthrown entirely. So what you can see then is in this story I've told you 5 separate mechanisms already interacting in different ways. Pre-colonial ethnographic representations of the colonized, the colonial state operating as a kind of a competitive field with its own specific forms of symbolic capital, cross-identification across the colonizer-colonized boundary, which could sometimes disrupt that, collaboration and resistance, that's the 4th, and actually the 5th I haven't mentioned yet, which is the geopolitical calculations of the international great powers in question. So that, for example, in the early 20th century, in the build-up to World War I, Germany becoming more isolated in Europe, losing all of its allies, or most of them, suddenly at least certain political actors within the German government decided to cultivate China as a kind of an ally in the Far East. Now, to cultivate China as a military ally in the build-up to World War I meant that you had to decide not to try and colonize China, because the Chinese government was appalled by the fact that Europe was carving colonies out of its, coastal coast. And so this geopolitical calculation led to certain changes in the way that Germany treated the Qingdao colony and other imperial ventures within China. So that's really the 5th mechanism that I look at. So what I've tried to do here is to be systematic about the mechanisms, and each of these mechanisms, the ethnographic discourse mechanism, the field mechanism, the mechanism of geopolitics, the mechanism of cross-identification, is rooted in an entire theoretical tradition and elaboration of the mechanisms in question. For example, the cross-identification with the colonized is rooted, at least in my account, in a psychoanalytic reading of psychic processes which lead certain people to seek imaginary resolutions to real-world symbolic problems. For example, being in a class-oppressed situation within Europe. And I distinguish, following psychoanalytic theory, especially French psychoanalytic theory of Jacques Lacan, between the imaginary and the symbolic. And this is really an imaginary solution to the problem in his strong sense of the imaginary, not just in an everyday sense of the imaginary. So each of these arguments is based in a kind of elaboration of a mechanism. And as I said earlier, I think this is distinctive to the kind of approach that many of us have adopted in the social sciences, that takes seriously the theoretical discourses about mechanisms as well as the empirical historical research.
So you could sort of make an analogy between this argument and Tilley and McAdam and Tarrow on social contention.
Yes.
Where their goal is to identify a relatively small number of mechanisms.
That's right.
But then to do a very crucial thing, and that is not to block out revolution, civil war, urban unrest as the natural kinds, but rather to see those episodes of large contention as being the outcome of the working of this relatively small number of mechanisms. With the result, you wouldn't expect there to be generalizations to occur across the cases, or strong generalizations.
Yeah.
The analogy with you is that your analysis would not suggest that colonialism basically ought to be one phenomenon which looks pretty much the same whether it's in China or in the South Pacific, but rather it's more of a family resemblance cluster sort of concept. And the real analysis is coming at the level of the mechanisms that you've identified.
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between what you call the real analysis of the mechanisms, which is a elaborated theoretical discourse that can become more and more elaborate as the ideas about these mechanisms and the models and the pictures we have of them becomes more elaborate in a dialogue with empirical research, of course. And the explanation of a historical event, for example, why did the Germans commit genocide in 1904 in Southwest Africa? It's a question I ask in the book, against the indigenous Herero people. It's widely known as the first genocide of the 20th century. I think this deserves explanation. And the explanation is a multifaceted, multi-mechanism one that I offer in the book. But it does draw primarily on the 5 main mechanisms that I've sketched out to you. They combine with different weights and in different places. They're not always all present, and so on and so forth. But in this case, the primary one is the pre-colonial representations and the field, and the nature of the field and the competition within the field, which pitted 2 groups of Germans from the nobility and the bourgeois and the educated, university-educated middle class against one another, leading to a spiraling upward of claims and counterclaims, with the noble representative Lothar von Trotha, who was the general involved in that genocide, primarily responsible for it, escalating his savagery, partially in response to the competition within the field to prove his own better understanding of the indigenous native character of the African. That's what I argue in the book. And not only as a result of, say, the military exigencies of the warfare with the Herero, or of the racist representations of the Herero that pre-existed the genocide. Because the question is, you had the representations all along. Why would it escalate to the point of genocide in 1904? So I think this is an explanation. But the mechanism and the elaboration of theoretical mechanisms, I wouldn't call that explanation. I would call that something like theoretical elaboration. And those are 2 separate types of process. Now, to go back to the McAdam and Tilley piece, the book that you were mentioning, my impression is there are perhaps 2 different differences. One is the question of natural kinds of events, and the other has to do with how one conceptualizes the work one is doing about the mechanism, around the mechanisms in question, and whether the mechanism in question is deserving of its own discussion unto itself, as it were. The other, though, is the one you mentioned, the question of natural kinds. Now, I think it would be hard to do any comparison. There are 2 types of comparison that one can do, I think. One is across events, and one is across mechanisms. And in an article I wrote called Odious Comparisons, I've tried to elaborate the differences between these kinds of comparisons. I could choose to compare the operation of a mechanism like field or symbolic capital or imaginary cross-identification across a wide variety of different historical times and places, perhaps to determine how historically extendable is this mechanism. Does the unconscious or does imaginary cross-identification hold in earlier historical periods or non-Western settings, for example? That would be a mechanism comparison. But I think what's also possible is to do an event comparison, as long as one is careful to define what it is about the events that they have in common, and to determine whether it's an exact equivalence or whether it's, as you point out, a family resemblance. Now, with colonialism, I think colonialism is an event, or perhaps a structure. I'm not sure which it is. It's an empirical structure, though. It's not an abstract theorized structure. It's an event structure, as it were, that is relatively, that can be defined as a spectrum of different political conditions. So I guess it is a family resemblance in your sense. But colonialism, it can be defined, at least I define it, as in using 2 criteria. The first of them is the conquest and seizure of sovereignty by a foreign power. So if you imagine a world of polities, when one polity invades another and rules that territory of the other polity in its place, where it replaces the native rulers with its own, that's the first criterion. That's kind of what I call the sovereignty criterion.